Chapter 11. Republican Instability and Salazarist Autocracy, 1910 to 1974. Republican Instability. The Republican Revolution in 1910 was followed by instability and frequent changes in government. There were changes in symbolism, from the national anthem to place names. Thus, in Lisbon in 1910, the name of the Rua das Trinas was changed to Rua Sara de Matos, whom it was alleged had been murdered by nuns, and a large monument was built to this martyr at the Prazeres cemetery. Across the country, the main town square became the Praça da República. In place of the former national flag, which had been the royal arms over a blue and white rectangle, a new flag, adopted in 1911, adopted red and green, the colours of the Republican Party, with the national coat of arms over the colour boundary. Church and state were formally separated during the Republic. All the religious orders were abolished, church properties were seized, and education secularized, while action was taken against popular religious festivals. Divorce was legalized, and in 1911 widows were given the vote as heads of families, although in 1913 they were excluded from that right. Women did not get the right to vote on an equal footing until the 1976 Constitution. Palaces became national monuments. The Royal Palace in Lisbon was turned into government offices. The murderers of the King and Crown Prince in 1908 were rehabilitated. Political instability was acute. There was monarchist pressure, notably incursions of monarchists from Spain near Chaves in October 1911 and July 1912 that, however, were quickly driven back by Republican troops, as well as the proclamation of a monarchy of the North in Oporto in January 1919. The latter, which was not backed by Manuel II, was rapidly suppressed. More seriously, the Republican movement splintered badly, with many changes in government. In January 1915, in order to circumvent the Cortes, which was dominated by the Republicans, the Conservative government was formed under General Joaquim Pimenta de Castro, a career military officer, but this was overthrown in May 1915 by military support for the Republicans. The First World War. Adding to the political crisis was the outbreak of war in Europe in 1914. Like much of Europe that year, Portugal remained neutral, as Spain did throughout the war. At the same time, Portugal had to adapt to the possibility of war. The first civilian air club was established in 1909, but it was only the Republican regime that started to think about adding aircraft to the armed forces. In 1914, in parallel with the debate about entering the war, the government established what was called the Military Aeronautic Service and bought from France for the army the first military aircraft in Portugal. Portugal long remained neutral, but its trade was hit by British and German economic warfare. Eventually, under British pressure focused on strengthening the blockade of Germany, Portugal entered the war in March 1916 on the Allied side. This unpopular and expensive decision was bitterly criticised by the trade unions. Portugal had interned German and Austrian ships in Lisbon the previous month in response to a British request. Germany declared war on the 9th of March. The government saw the war as the key to a glorious future for Portugal. Troops were sent to the Western Front, arriving there in April 1917. There were heavy losses for the Portuguese troops there in the Battle of the Lys on the 9th of April 1918 in the German spring offensives. The Portuguese 2nd Division held the centre of the attacked position, and, poorly commanded and with variable morale, it was overrun with the loss of about 7,400 men, mostly made prisoner. There had already been fighting with German troops in Africa from 1914. The war also brought change to the military. Within the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps deployed to northern France in 1917, an air combat unit was planned. It was not sent, but single officers with flying expertise were posted to British and French units, and thus became the first Portuguese fighter pilots. Also in 1917, the Navy established its aviation service and school, while in Mozambique in 1917 to 1918, there were Portuguese air operations against forces invading from neighbouring German East Africa. Portugal mobilised 105,500 troops. 55,000 went to the Western Front and the rest to Africa. The war cost about 7,760 dead, 16,600 wounded, 13,600 missing in action and prisoners, and 96 ships sunk. Instability, 1917 to 1925. The unpopular anti-clerical government of Afonso Costa, Prime Minister on 3 occasions, was overthrown in December 1917 by a revolutionary committee under Sidónio Pais, a prominent Republican and opponent of the war, who benefited from popular anger with wartime shortages, although the coup essentially relied on only 250 men. This committee was referred to by its supporters as the New Republic. The confused nature of the confrontation in Lisbon was captured by Major General Nathaniel Bernardiston, the chief of the British military mission. The fleet got to work and the field pieces replied, but were almost all short. I only saw one go over, and none apparently anywhere near. There was intermittent rifle fire all night as rioters were looting shops, etc. The Prime Minister was imprisoned and the President deposed. Costa went into exile in Paris. The new dictatorship, with Pais as President, Prime Minister, War Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, continued Portugal's role in the war, and also responded within Portugal with force to conspiracies and riots, leading to a state of emergency in October 1918. However, Pais was assassinated that December in the main Lisbon railway station by a left-wing activist. The Liberal Republic returned and gained the East African Kionga Triangle in the post-war Treaty of Versailles. The area had been seized by the Portuguese in 1916, rectifying a German encroachment on Portuguese territory in 1894. Alongside a measure of modernism in Portuguese culture and society, for example, the spread of the cinema, of aviation and of the press, political instability continued, as was also the case across much of Europe, including Spain. Indeed, modernism was a reaction to the perception that democracy had failed and that Portugal had become decadent. This was an aspect of the culture wars that was to be won by traditionalism. At the same time, radicalism, authoritarianism, and the varied types of republican continuity were all in a dynamic and destructive tension. The existing system was under much pressure. There were frequent strikes. The Republican government was unpopular due to anti-clericalism and economic instability. There were many changes in government, some due to force. Prime Minister Antonio Granjo and 2 other key moderate Republican politicians were assassinated on the 19th of October 1921 during the Bloody Night, a radical revolt by junior officers. In the end, the government of President Bernardino Machado was overthrown by an army coup in 1926 that created a conservative order. The coup of the 28th of May, moreover, ended the Portuguese First Republic. Much of the army had not forgiven the Republic for sending it into the First World War. 2 failed coups in 1925 had not ended military agitation against the Republic, which was led after the victory of the Republican Party in the elections of the 8th of November 1925 by Antonio Maria de Silva. The plotters in 1926 benefited from the support of General Manuel Gomes da Costa, who had commanded on the Western Front in 1918. He led the revolution in Braga, and from there it rapidly spread on the 29th of May 1926 to Oporto, Lisbon and other major cities. The government resigned that day, and the coup leader in Lisbon, José Mendes Cabeçades, a democratic sympathiser, became prime minister, with an economist, António de Oliveira Salazar, soon after made Minister of Finance. Salazar in power. A keen Catholic, Salazar was born in 1889 in Vimiero to a family of small landowners. Educated for 8 years at a seminary, Salazar eventually decided not to become a priest and instead studied law at the University of Coimbra, developing a particular interest in finance and economic policy. Becoming an academic at Coimbra, he was appalled by the political and economic instability of the First Republic, which he depicted as chaos, as well as horrified by its anti-clericalism. In 1933, he reflected on the situation prior to his regime. Our revolutions, our apparent incapacity to govern ourselves, the rottenness of our administration, our general backwardness, all were held up to our national discredit. In June 1926, after another coup, Gomes da Costa took power, only for him to be forced into exile the following month as a result of a coup by more conservative figures. Another general, António Oscar de Fragoso Carmona, then took power and survived 2 coup attempts that September. He was president from November 1926 to April 1951, when he died. Carmona reappointed Salazar Minister of Finance in 1928 and nominated him as Prime Minister in 1932. Oppressed by a heavy public debt, the new government faced bankruptcy, and this made Salazar, a monetarist who set out by imposing austerity to balance the budget, particularly influential. Carmona became a figurehead, and Salazar, who served as Prime Minister until 1968, was the key figure under the new constitution of 1933 that officially established the Estado Novo, the new state, as the Second Republic was known. Drawing on papal encyclicals of 1891 and 1931, this was a corporatist, authoritarian state pledged to national regeneration. Salazar was opposed to party government. The civilian regime, not a militarist one, the Estado Novo used troops, such as those deployed in 1934 against strikes, but relied more on the Polícia de Vigilância e Defesa do Estado, a highly effective secret police force established in 1933 that was ready to use brutal means. Towns were physically dominated by military garrisons and police stations, and the new fascist-style architecture was often that of control, as in the courthouse in Oporto. The regime also had a uniformed paramilitary organisation, the Portuguese Legion, and youth movement. Censorship also played an important role. It was both political and ideological in its character, and more generally opposed to new ideas and thus modernism. The regime was clear in its hostility to communism, atheism, socialism, anarchism, democracy, and liberalism. Freemasonry, which was closely linked to the Republican Party and was anti-clerical, was attacked under the new regime from 1929, and in 1935 it was declared illegal to be a Freemason. This legislation remained in force until the Carnation Revolution of 1974. There were close links with the Catholic Church. The Concordat with the Vatican in 1940 repealed many of the anti-clerical policies of the First Republic, and the Church took over religious instruction in state schools. Church building showed the new relationship. Begun in 1904 and inspired by the Sacré-Cœur in Paris, the building of the Temple of the Sacred Crown of Jesus at Viana do Castelo had been interrupted in 1910 as the Republic sought to separate church and state. Resumed in 1926, it was finished in 1959. The commitment to Catholicism was demonstrated in the massive basilica begun in 1928 and completed in 1953, built as a focus for the large-scale pilgrimage to Fatima that had begun with a vision of the Virgin Mary being seen by 3 peasant children in 1917. The Cristo Rei statue on the heights above Almada opposite Lisbon, built in 1949 to 1959, was on the model of that in Rio de Janeiro, which is far larger. The church was led by Cardinal Manuel Gonçalves Querejera, Patriarch of Lisbon from 1929 to 1971, a personal friend of Salazar. In contrast, Antonio Ferreira Gomes, Bishop of Oporto, was in practice exiled for 10 years from 1959 to 1969 for privately writing to Salazar in 1958, criticizing government policy for, in effect, promoting poverty and social inequality, and therefore helping communism. Salazar did not appreciate criticism. Salazar had scant time for fascism, which he saw as anti-clerical. His dictatorship was based on tradition rather than on fascist modernity. In addition, Salazar was backed by the exiled Manuel II and thus won the support of most monarchists. Seeking the backing of those he saw as moderates, Salazar benefited from the widespread relief that greeted stability after the disorder of 1910 to 1926, and from the ability of Catholic corporatism to win him considerable support. Social cohesion was presented as an alternative to class division and political sectionalism. At the same time, this was very much not a democratic system. The new legislature, the National Assembly, could only have members of the National Union, União Nacional, the Salazarist movement, while the parallel corporative chamber had official representatives, including of the official workers' syndicates that were supported in place of free trade unions, which were outlawed, as were political parties. The Labour legislation was based on that of fascist Italy. The president had much constitutional power, but Carmona left Salazar in control, although he became irritated with him and intrigued against him in the late 1940s. The new constitution was approved in a national referendum in 1933. The 99.52% listed as voters in favour, including the large number of abstentions. The following year, the leadership of the National Syndicalists, or Blue Shirts, was purged, as Salazar underlined his opposition to fascism, prefiguring the tension in Hungary and Romania between right-wing regimes and fascists. Salazar faced wide-ranging opposition, including a monarchist revolt in 1935 and a revolt by the crews of 2 warships in Lisbon in September 1936. This opposition was suppressed, and those convicted, in special summary courts, sent to the new deadly Tarrafal prison camp in the Cape Verde Islands. There were also prisons in and near Lisbon and on São Tomé, in all of which political prisoners were held. The attempted coup led to the imposition of loyalty oaths on all civil servants. En route to Mass, Salazar, moreover, survived an assassination attempt by an anarcho-syndicalist in 1937. The following year, a bulletproof Mercedes-Benz, which survives in the car museum in Caramulu, was ordered for Salazar. This was a dictatorship under the guise of a republic. Salazar supported Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, providing the nationalists with a key source of supplies, as well as a volunteer force, the so-called viriatos, of 4,000 to 5,000, although the reported number varies. However, Salazar did not join Italy and Germany in their public commitment, let alone extent of support. In 1938, Portugal recognized Franco's government, which was by then clearly winning the war, and in March 1939, as Franco won, signed the Iberian Pact, which was a non-aggression pact and a treaty of mutual support against any attack on either. The pact was expanded in July 1940 after the fall of France. Given Franco's support for Hitler, this was an alignment that, while dictated by a search for security, was also scarcely that of clear neutrality. At the same time, the fate of Spain was scarcely encouraging for Portugal. For Germany, which had intervened from the outset on Franco's side in the Spanish Civil War, There were ideological and geopolitical goals, but also an economic strategy. Hitler sought a new European economic order in which Germany would become the leader of a European space free of Anglo-American influence, and with the goals and terms of central planned rationalization and specialization set in Berlin. By early 1939, Germany was taking 3/4 of Spain's exports, so that Spain was brought into an informal Reichsmark sphere. The sectors targeted were iron ore, pyrites, copper, tungsten or wolfram, and foodstuffs. The Second World War. During the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, although Japan occupied its colony of East Timor in 1942, Portugal was neutral, in line with Salazar's view of the damaging impact of the First World War on the country. Indeed, as part of the process by which the country made money by trading with both sides, Portugal sold tungsten, a basis for the strengthened steel used in particular for tanks, to both, Salazar resisting Allied pressure not to do so to Germany. Salazar did not wish to offend the then victorious Germany in the early 1940s, or to provide Spain with an opportunity to attack Portugal, which Franco certainly considered. Portugal was Europe's largest source of tungsten, and the industry was a major source of jobs and revenue. However, the army thwarted Salazar's attempt to please the Germans by ending the commemoration of the country's role in the First World War. Alongside Era, Portugal flew flags at half-mast after the death of Hitler. Macau was not occupied by the Japanese, but in 1943 they intimidated the Portuguese into accepting advisors, who in effect ran it. In 1945, American aircraft attacked Macau. Neutrality ensured that Portugal became a place of refuge for those escaping the trials of war and persecution, from Jews to kings. Estoril became known as the Coast of Kings, and the Palace Hotel there contains a gallery of photographs of the royalty who stayed there, many during the war. The hotel was also a popular haunt of spies. German spies were able to tap the cable and wireless cables. Others operated out of Portuguese colonies. Some Portuguese exiles from Salazar's rule returned to Portugal to take refuge from German power, only to be confined, as Bernardino Machado was on his estate, on his return from France in 1940. The Portuguese Communist Party, however, although banned, encouraged illegal strikes in 1942 to 1943. Hollywood films of the early 1940s presented a sanitized view of Portugal and the Salazar regime compared to their coverage of Franco's Spain. The American Office of War Information encouraged this account, which romanticized local living conditions and did not discuss the fascist practices of the Salazar regime. In October 1943, in a key development in the Battle of the Atlantic, Portugal permitted Britain to establish the Lajes air base on the Azores, the Americans following with the Santa Maria base in November 1944. This provided a crucial capability in closing the mid-Atlantic air gap in Allied air cover against U-boats, notably what the Germans termed the Black Pit west of the Azores. In June 1944, Salazar finally yielded to Allied pressure to stop tungsten exports to Germany, which by then was clearly going to lose the war. The post-war Salazar system. The provision of the Azores bases helped ensure that Portugal, much to the disappointment of those Portuguese who wanted change, was viewed far more favourably by the United States after the war than Spain, which had also been neutral. Indeed, in 1948, Portugal became a founding member of the Organisation for European Economic Cooperation, which was important in the justification and allocation of aid through the American Marshall Plan. Portugal was the sole dictatorship to receive Marshall Plan aid and obtained $70 million in 1950 to 1951. In 1949, Portugal was a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. American influence led to a degree of modernization, including the bringing together in 1952 of the Army and Naval Air Services in order to create an air force. In 1957, Queen Elizabeth II paid a formal state visit. Moreover, Portugal was one of the founding members of the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, in 1960, and of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1961. Domestically, the regime, which had won the rigged elections of November 1945, continued to be authoritarian and reasonably united. There was opposition, but it was divided politically, socially, and over tactics. Moreover, the regime actively sought to suppress opposition. In 1948, a movement for liberalization, the Movement of Democratic Unity, founded in October 1945, was banned. A large number of communist activists were arrested in 1949. There was opposition to the regime within the army, but in October 1946, the Meada revolt did not prove the major military uprising that had been anticipated. Another rebellion by left-wing officers failed the following April. Close links were maintained with Spain, although France was opposed to Portugal joining NATO without Spain. The dining room where Franco and Salazar met in 1950 can be visited in the 19th-century neoclassical Brejoeira Palace near Monção. In 1965, with Salazar's approval, the secret police assassinated Humberto Delgado, who would have won the presidential election of 1958, had it been held fairly. Delgado, an Air Force general, had promised, if he did so, to dismiss Salazar. His campaign was linked to large pro-reform demonstrations in Lisbon and Oporto. After the election, which was won by Admiral Américo Tomás, a Salazar loyalist, Delgado was expelled from the military, went into exile in Brazil and Algeria, and founded the Portuguese National Liberation Front. He mounted an unsuccessful mutiny in Beja Barracks in 1962. With the support of the Spanish secret police, Delgado was lured back into Portugal near Olivença, supposedly to meet members of the opposition, and was murdered. Meanwhile, political prisoners continued to be held, although Álvaro Cunhal, the Communist Party leader, managed to escape from Peniche in 1960. The 1958 election led to a constitutional change, taking the choice of president away from the popular vote, with the risk of unpredictability it posed, and instead towards the National Assembly, which was under Salazar. In 1962, riot police suppressed demonstrating students in the University of Lisbon. They were complaining at the closure of student organizations associated with opposition to the government. There was renewed pressure for change in 1968. With its backward agriculture, Portugal continued to be poor. The production of coal, iron and oil was nugatory, although there was electricity thanks to hydroelectric power, with the first power station reliant on the dam built from 1946 at Castelo do Bode on the river Ziezera. There was a lack of investment, in large part due to the protectionist, corporatist nature of the economy, combined with Salazar's pronounced policy of fiscal caution. This ensured that there was no basis for domestic investment, while foreign investment and competition were constrained. In particular, the large-scale American investment and new production techniques that were so important in much of Western Europe were not really matched in Portugal. As with Spain, the 1960s, however, saw an expansion in the tourist industry. The opening of an airport at Faro in 1965, an immediate success, combined with the spread of jet aircraft and the growing prosperity of northern European workers, to encourage sun and sand tourism to the Algarve. The economy did not provide the jobs for a growing population, nor indeed prosperity for most of them. Economic development was limited. Emigration continued to Brazil and was encouraged to Angola. In addition, there was emigration to Venezuela and, on a large scale, to France, Germany, Switzerland, Luxembourg and Belgium. The government did not try to stop this. Others went elsewhere, for example, to South Africa. Many of those who emigrated to France were political exiles. Large numbers settled in Paris, where many concierges were Portuguese. Alongside emigration, there was more limited compulsory education than elsewhere in Western Europe, and higher illiteracy rates, and that despite the building of over 7,000 new schools in the 1940s and 1950s. Much housing was poor and often without running water or electricity. Notwithstanding the dictatorship, however, there was some economic and social progress in the 1950s and 1960s. Indeed, it was that progress that helped turn the country against Salazar and his successor, Marcelo Caetano. Salazar's ideology. In the face of growing international pressure for decolonization, pressure that kept Portugal out of the United Nations until 1955, Salazar supported an ideology of imperial development. In the Colonial Act of 1930, Salazar had centralized the administration of the overseas territories and advocated bringing the colonial population into the Portuguese nation by means of assimilation, although in practice most Africans were to continue living according to their tribal traditions. Specific hardships included the need to pay taxes in Portuguese currency, which obliged them, in effect, to work as forced labourers in order to get the money. To Salazar, Portugal's role and mission in large part arose from its colonies, and he also endorsed the ideas of Luso-tropicalism associated with Gilberto Freire, a Brazilian writer. The global ideology of Salazarism, one that located Portugal's colonies in a world mission and that led to these colonies being renamed overseas provinces in 1951, was explained in the second edition of the Atlas de Portugal by Aristide d'Amorim Girau, 1895–1960, professor of geography at Salazar's University, Coimbra. Published there in 1959, the atlas included, as a prologue, a section on how Portugal was born and spread over the world that had not been in the 1941 first edition. The preface to the second edition, published in facing columns in English and Portuguese, expounded the Portuguese theory of colonization. The second edition of the Atlas of Portugal, whilst still addressed to the author's countrymen, has a special purpose: to make better known to foreigners a country which many people still regard as merely a Spanish province. There are also many fallacies concerning the geography of Portugal, alike of Portugal at home and of Portugal overseas, circulating in foreign books, for some minds are still influenced by mistaken ideas of colonialism and are unable to understand how a nation may be a complete entity, although dispersed throughout the world without continuous land boundaries. Portugal was described as a nation whose lot it was to fulfill an exploratory and civilizing mission without equal, and cartography was seen to have a role in showing the organic whole that overseas provinces form with the mother country. The cartographical presentation of certain little-known facts will perhaps help towards a better understanding of how these different plots of land are, finally, just so many other members of a huge national organization with a maritime base, which, in obedience to an essentially Christian and humanitarian idea of unity, and in the geopolitical realization of the evangelical mandate, Euntes in Mundum Universum, struck deep roots in the soil of 4 continents. The section on how Portugal was born consisted of 9 maps, mostly devoted to the war with the Muslims. The facing text ended, "Portugal thus comes into being, and its worldwide missionary call is immediately confirmed in St. Anthony of Lisbon, 1190 to 1231, making his voice heard over nearly the whole of Europe, as may be seen by the journeys he undertook. Portugal's historic Christian mission was further revealed in the 5 maps and facing text of the section How Portugal Spread Over the World. The 4th map presented Lisbon as the new Rome, and the 5th, which showed the journeys of the 16th century Spanish Jesuit missionary St. Francis Xavier, the apostle to the Far East, who typified the great missionary and civilizing activity of Portugal, was entitled Goa, Rome of the East. Xavier was mostly active in and from the Portuguese Empire, where John III sponsored Jesuit missionary activity, helping forward the Jesuit idea of an empire of apostles. The empire was presented in the atlas as natural and organic, and not as the consequence of conquest. This was an ideology that gave Portugal apparent meaning. A 1934 map overlapped the Portuguese metropolitan and colonial territories with Europe, showing how Portugal is not a small country. Under Salazar, Portugal's history, both taught and celebrated, focused on the Middle Ages and the Age of Discovery, and not on modern times, which instead threatened to draw attention to divisions within the country. Commemorative monuments, such as that near the cathedral at Oporto, and the restoration of buildings, were designed accordingly. Thus, the 12th century tower of the castle at Lamego was restored as part of the celebrations for the 800th anniversary of independence in 1139. Built in 1187, the castle at Bragança was heavily restored in the 1930s, the castle of Guimarães following in the 1940s. From 1939, the government transformed the remains of the castle of Almirol, making it more medieval with the addition of crenellations. The castle was made an official residence of the Portuguese Republic. In 1940, work began on repairing the castle at Monsanto, work that continued for 2 more years and that resumed in 1957 to 1958. A somewhat different legacy was the Portugal dos Pequenitos, begun in Coimbra in 1938 and with the first phase opened in 1940. This was a park offering scaled-down replica versions of typical buildings in parts of Portugal, notably the north. The second phase consisted of monuments and heritage sites, and the third phase, finished at the end of the 1950s, provided coverage of the overseas empire as well as of Brazil. The site still has about 250,000 visitors annually. The year 1940 was a key date for the commemoration of the past, as it was that of the Portuguese World Exhibition, which was designed to mark 800 years from the foundation of the country and 300 years from the restoration of independence. Held in the Praça do Império in Belém, there were over 3 million visitors. Carmona opened the exhibition, with Salazar in attendance. Empire was a key element in an exhibition that really focused on the past. There were major exhibits from all the colonies, and Brazil, then under a dictator in his own, Estado Novo, was the sole independent state invited. A replica of a 17th century galleon was a major sight, as was a monument to Portugal's explorers, which was constructed of wood, unlike the concrete monument to the discoveries constructed at Belém in 1960 for the 500th anniversary of the death of Henry the Navigator, who is the leading sculpture in the impressive, indeed inspiring, monument. 2 years later, a maritime museum was opened in the west wing of the Jerônimos Museum. Henry was widely celebrated, including in 1960 by tiles put up on the outside wall of an historic church in western Oporto. Another echo of the age of exploration was the armillary spheres that topped many new state buildings in the 1940s. Constructed in a traditional style, they were condemned by critics as soft Portuguese, on the grounds that they lacked artistic creativity. A museum, replete with the ruralist and traditionalist values of the Salazar regime, was the Museum of Portuguese Folk Art, opened in Lisbon in 1948. It showed local costumes and other traditional handicrafts. This was in accordance with the idealization by the Catholic Rite of the Minho region, the birthplace of Portugal. The emphasis on things to see has been related to the stress under Salazar on a regime in which the public was expected to be more passive and docile than in Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. The mass rallies of the latter were very much not the tone of Salazar's Portugal. Empire under pressure. The Museum of Design in Lisbon occupies the central site of the former bank that handled the currencies of Portugal's colonies. In the former bank's lobby there is a colourful and large wall mosaic from 1962 depicting Portugal's colonisation of Africa from the 15th century. The mosaic itself is a reference back to Roman methods of decoration, including in Portugal. The colonisation is presented in benign terms, with friars teaching natives, other natives farming, and the Portuguese soldiers not shown engaged in any violent acts. Ethnic harmony, progress, and Christian proselytization under Portuguese leadership were the key themes. Attractive, misleading, but convenient for Portugal, which in 1962 was confronting the outbreak of revolution in Angola. Risings in Angola 1961, Guinea-Bissau 1963 and Mozambique 1964, each, and even more together, posed a more serious and long-lasting problem. The Portuguese were able to retain control of the towns, for example crushing a rising in Luanda, the major city of Angola, in 1961. Nevertheless, they found it impossible to suppress rural opposition. In addition, their opponents could operate from neighbouring states. Guerrillas moved from attacks on border villages to a more extensive guerrilla war that sought to win popular support and to develop liberated rural areas. Due to military commitments in Angola, the Portuguese had reduced their presence in Goa to 4,000 troops, and in 1961 the Indians overran it with 71,000 men in one day. There was little fighting. The Americans, although allied to Portugal in NATO, refused appeals for help. Diu and Damau in India were also captured. Also in 1961, Dahomey obliged Portugal to abandon São João Batista da Judá, which had been an active Portuguese Atlantic trading port in the 18th century and a Portuguese possession from 1865. At the time of its abandonment, at only 5 acres and 2 inhabitants, it was the smallest recognised political unit in the world. Portugal did not recognise this annexation until the effective end of empire in 1975. Insert. Eusébio, a stunning footballer. Moving from Mozambique to join Benfica, a leading Portuguese club, in 1961, Eusébio, 1942 to 2014, was an accomplished striker. Of mixed-race background, he made his name scoring hat-tricks in 1961, had his debut for Portugal later that year, and helped Benfica beat Real Madrid in the European Cup final the following May with 2 goals. He scored 9 goals in the 1966 World Cup, although Portugal was beaten by England in the semi-final. From the 1960s, greatly expanding the size of the army, the Portuguese fought hard in Africa, using tactical air support, helicopters, napalm and aggressive herbicides. They also sought support both from Cold War allies and from white-run governments, notably South Africa. In the early 1960s, the white-dominated Central African Federation, now Zambia, Zimbabwe and Malawi, then part of the British Empire, actively supported the white cause in Congo after the Belgian pullout in 1960, leading to international policies at variance with those of Britain, including separate negotiations with Portugal. After southern Rhodesia unilaterally declared independence from Britain in 1965, it also aligned with Portugal, with which it had a frontier in Mozambique. Indeed, southern Rhodesia became much more vulnerable to attack once the Portuguese eventually withdrew from Mozambique in 1975. Earlier, the Portuguese benefited greatly from divisions among their opponents, especially between the MPLA and UNITA in Angola, and from the support of the white rule apartheid government of South Africa. Moreover, they were able to control many key rural areas, especially the Central Highlands of Angola. Until 1974, the 70,000-strong Portuguese army in Angola, supported by secret police, paramilitary forces, settler vigilantes, and African informers, effectively restricted guerrilla operations there, and, more generally, protected the 350,000 white settlers in the colony. By then, the revolutions had become more challenging. Opposition to Portuguese rule looked back to earlier resistance to the imposition of imperial rule, as among the Bakongo of northern Angola, but it was affected by a growing politicization in terms of more modern political ideologies, notably revolutionary socialism. There was direct reference to the Mao Zedong principles of revolutionary war, as well as training by advisers from the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba, and a provision by them of more advanced weapons, although many did not arrive in any quantity until the early 1970s. Anti-personnel and anti-vehicle mines affected Portuguese mobility, while Soviet SAM-7 missiles hit their low-flying aircraft and helicopters. From 1973, the latter shifted the balance of military advantage in Guinea-Bissau, and from 1974 in Mozambique. These missiles contributed to a sense that the Portuguese had lost the initiative. Although the Portuguese were reasonably successful in Angola, failure elsewhere sapped support for the war in the army and in Portugal. Alongside growing military dissatisfaction with the war, there was popular hostility to conscription, with many fleeing abroad in order to escape it, part of the changing but continual diaspora of energy and talent under Salazar. The war effort cost close to 40% of public spending, and the percentage of the total population involved in the war was considerably greater than that of the Americans in Vietnam. Portugal's gains from the global economic growth of the 1960s were spent on an intractable war. Caetano in power, 1968 to 1974. By the time of failure in Africa, Salazar was dead. In 1961, he had survived the attempt by General Julio Botelho Muniz, the new Minister of Defense, to persuade President Américo Tomás, the victor in 1958, to dismiss the aged Salazar. Instead, the general was dismissed. The episode, however, was evidence of division and discontent within the military. Each was to be more obvious than in the case of Spain in Franco's last 2 decades. In August 1968, the 79-year-old Salazar suffered a cerebral hemorrhage when he fell from a chair while staying in the Estoril fortress. He was replaced in September by Marcelo Caetano, although he lingered on until 1970, being allowed, when he recovered lucidity, to believe that he was still Prime Minister, and with fake cabinet meetings held accordingly. One of the more surprising aspects of his legacy is the Harry Potter character, Salazar Slytherin, who derives from J.K. Rowling's immersion in Portuguese life while in Oporto. Slytherin built the Chamber of Secrets. Caetano was a conservative politician who long held office under Salazar, initially as head of the Portuguese Youth Organization, later as Minister of the Colonies, President of the Executive Board of the National Union, and Minister attached to the Presidency of the Council of Ministers, the latter effectively the number 2 to Salazar. In power, Caetano was ready to help economic growth, and in what was presented as the political spring, sought to lessen repression, for example, easing censorship and permitting independent trade unions, which has led to later, somewhat misleading comparisons with Mikhail Gorbachev of Russia. The opposition was allowed to run in the 1969 elections, although the government won every seat. However, some places were granted to the so-called liberal wing, a number of young technocrats whose support Caetano had won. Caetano, however, was unwilling to maintain his reform policies. He lost the support of the liberal wing from 1971, and in 1973 yielded over policy to pressure from President Tomasz and the regime's hardliners. In addition, Caetano had no intention of abandoning the opposition to colonial independence movements. Isolated, the government was increasingly under strain from both without and within, and the authoritarianism and internal cohesion that had sustained the Salazar regime were sapped by changes within society. At the same time, there was no significant international action against the Portuguese government other than in Africa. Change in Portugal would depend on the position within, so also with Spain. Brazilian parallels. As in Portugal after 1910, the Republican coup in Brazil in 1889 led to instability. The leader of the 1889 coup, Field Marshal Deodoro de Fonseca, became head of state, while army officers benefited from salary increases, influential appointments, and an increase in the size of the army. Force became normative, with Deodoro resigning in 1891 in the face of a naval revolt in support of the vice-president Floriano Peixoto, an army leader who had played a key role in the 1889 coup. The authoritarianism of the latter led to a fresh naval revolt. It was unsuccessful in the face of army support for the government, but military rule came to an end for a while after the presidential election of 1894. José de Almada Negreiros and Fernando Pessoa. A child of the wider Portuguese Empire, Almada Negreiros, 1893–1970, the painter of Portuguese modernism, was born in São Tomé, the son of a Portuguese father and a Santomean mother. Educated in Lisbon, he introduced Portugal to futuristic aesthetics in 1917. During the Salazar years, he acted both as an artistic agitator, criticising society and attacking conformism and mediocrity, and as an aligned artist, producing public mural paintings. His works include a black-red portrait of Fernando Pessoa, 1888–1935, which is held in the Modern Art Centre in Lisbon. Pessoa was the greatest Portuguese poet alongside Camões, and the leading literary figure of 20th century Portugal. In 1915, he played a key role alongside Almada Negreiros in introducing modernism into Portugal. An active writer and literary critic, Pessoa was committed to Lisbon, and there are 2 statues to him there. Critical of the instability of the Republic, Pessoa became disenchanted with Salazar. As with Portugal, Brazil declared war on Germany, which it did in October 1917 as a result of German submarine attacks and American pressure. However, only a small naval squadron was eventually dispatched, and it did not see active service. Again, as with Portugal, there was instability in the 1920s. There were small-scale military revolts in 1922 and 1924. But these were suppressed by the loyal majority of the army and finally defeated in 1927, after an attempt to take refuge in the interior had failed. However, in 1930 the government was overthrown when the army proved unwilling to resist a rebel force advancing on São Paulo, the economic and political centre of the country. The rebellion, which began on the 3rd of October, stemmed from an unwillingness to accept the verdict of the presidential election of March 1930, which had rewarded the dominant oligarchs of the state of São Paulo. Instead, claiming an overseeing right as custodians for the nation, the army seized power on the 24th of October, before, on the 3rd of November, handing it to Getúlio Vargas, the leader of the revolt and the defeated candidate in March. In turn, federal forces suppressed a large-scale revolt against Vargas in São Paulo in 1932, as well as a small-scale communist rising in 1935. In 1937, Vargas used troops to dissolve Congress, declared a state of national emergency, and established the Estado Novo, in which he enjoyed near-dictatorial powers. He remained president until 1945. Unlike Portugal, Brazil, which did not have pro-German Spain as a neighbour, joined the Allies in the Second World War. An attempted fascist coup in 1938 had encouraged a reliance on the United States. Brazil eventually followed the United States in declaring war on Germany and Italy. It did so on the 22nd of August, 1942, in response to submarine attacks. The Navy and Air Force helped the Allies in the Atlantic War with German submarines in 1942 to 1945, and 25,000 troops were sent to fight as part of the Allied army in Italy in 1944 to 1945. Like Salazar, Vargas followed a protectionist policy. Vargas returned to power in 1950, this time democratically elected, holding power until 1954. However, concern about communism and instability led the military, eager to impose progress and order, to take over power in 1964. Very different to the Portuguese coup a decade later, this was supported by the United States. This coup produced a dictatorship that lasted until 1985, and that initially brought, alongside the killing of dissidents, economic growth in the 1970s, only to end up in the 1980s facing serious economic problems and major unpopularity. As a result, an election in 1985 produced an opposition president, and in 1988 a democratic constitution was introduced. Since then, Brazil has remained a democracy with an element of statist corporatism. In 2018, the Brazilian army head rejected talk of a new military dictatorship as the product of the victory in the presidential election of Jair Messias Bolsonaro, a candidate who had been an army officer and who praised the 1964 to 1985 regime. No such outcome is likely for Portuguese politics.